Come on. Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN AM for Friday, February 14th, 2020. And a happy Valentine's Day to you and yours. Here are our top stories. We'll take a look at the state of higher education, talk about engineering and the current state of students, and then we'll delve into the history of nuclear weapons. You're not going to want to miss this show. Well, let's welcome to the program Professor Alex Wellerstein. He is a professor of history and science with the Stevens Institute of Technology. Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm really happy to be here, Jeff.
It's great to see you. You've got a deep, rich history, and I want to get into the actual academics and things and I'm hoping to learn something today. I always learn something, but hoping to learn something from you today. But let's talk about being a professor, what that's like. You're a well-traveled individual, you're well-studied, but what is it like teaching America's students today?
It can vary. It can depend on where you are and what kind of students you have. Here at Stevens, we're an engineering school, and so you get people who are interested in STEM, as you would imagine. But they're also, the reason why people are going to engineering schools is not usually just because they have an inherent love of STEM, but because they believe it's going to get them a good job. And we're an expensive school, like many engineering schools. I believe we're the most expensive school in New Jersey. And the reason students and their parents are willing to do that and potentially go into a lot more debt than I went into as a student, the whole debt thing has changed in the last 20 years, is because they want to get a job. And so on the one hand, it's not the case where, and there are people who lament this, where you're getting students who they're there because they have the love of learning and they love to read, but it's also not the case that they just want to get their ticket punched. But they want an outcome. They want a specific economic outcome. And so especially for those of us in the humanities, where nobody ever says, I want to be a historian of science when I grow up, right? It's not a known thing. And the economic prospects are not bad, but often unclear. Mm-hmm. If you study accounting, you know that there's a job waiting for you in accounting at the end of it. When you study history, what are you going to do with that is always the question. And so the trick for somebody like me is to be able to tell the student and their parents, as an aside, because they're part of this conversation, sometimes explicitly, but always implicitly. What are you going to get out of this? How do you translate this into a job? And then also, how do I take your energy that is devoted towards, say, getting a job and end up teaching you something in the process anyway, right? How do I take that energy where they see the best result as being a sort of economic benefit, but me also saying, yes, we can do economic benefits, but there's an intellectual benefit as well. And can we make those two things not opposed to each other? Can we make them actually joined at the hip so that you learn this thing both because it's interesting and it makes you an educated person, but also this will be valuable in your future career? And so for somebody like history of science, I always start every class with why learn this? Why study 10,000 years of history of science and technology? Sure, it's fun. There's cool stories. I'm a pretty okay speaker, and it's a good time. But I also say, look, you're going to go into a world. We live in a world that is dominated by science and technology. If you're going to succeed in this world and be more than a cog in a very big machine, you're going to want to know how that world works, how it got the way it got, what directions it might be going into. And history does not give you all the answers for that, but it can give you some of the answers, and it can give you a perspective that people who don't know it probably don't have. And so that's the kind of work I do to, as a humanist, especially, and especially in a STEM context, sort of be very explicit about what the value of this is, because you cannot just appeal to, well, knowledge is a good thing. That doesn't work on kids who have an economic uncertainty, and they've been told since they were 5 years old that they're going to live in their parents' basement, and they don't want to do it.
Let's explore that a little bit, because I know we've talked about some of that offline. There is this, I think, misperception. I mean, you cannot brand a whole generation by one, even a few actors, right? I mean, each individual is unique. But there is the millennial, Gen Z, people kind of say that these folks, they're going to live in their parents' basement. They went through the financial crisis. What's their perspective? You sit across from them, you talk to them on a regular basis. How do they view the world? How do they think about economics and finance in addition to the course load that you're teaching?
They are thinking a lot about future careers, and the debt issue weighs on them very heavily. It weighs on them and it weighs on their parents. If I don't know how many of them take out a full debt load. I'm sure there's a lot of tuition assistance. I don't know the economics of Stevens, but if they were taking out full debt for an education here, you're talking about finishing college with $250,000 worth of debt, which is astounding.
That's a lot of money.
I often feel like I have to remind my sometimes fellow professors, I'm not the oldest professor around here by far, but I was able to finish school with no debt. And that opened up a lot of possibilities because I could I'll just have this little kind of dinky job for a while. I worked at a VHS store, right? Like jobs that don't exist anymore, right? And figured out what I wanted to do and decided to get a PhD. And you can do that kind of stuff if you have a little bit of financial stability. If you're getting these payment requests coming in, right, for that kind of money, you don't have that option. You've got to jump right into the workforce, and ideally you want to jump in well into the workforce. And an engineering degree can help you do that. A quantitative finance degree can help you do that. So we get a lot of people who are interested in quantitative finance. And I get why. I mean, it makes sense. This is what our society values very heavily. I have a very good friend here who's a physicist, and he's been teaching at Stevens since, I think, 1963. He's retired, but he still teaches. He's great. Very interesting guy. And he laments that when he was a young scientist, he got his undergraduate degree in 1957, that the best students, they go into physics. And then it became the best students go into genetics. And now it's the best students go into quantitative finance. And he says this in the way of a physicist, which is sort of denigrating that as being what we're expending our brain power on, making money for often other people. But I sometimes wonder about these sort of structural issues and what kinds of societies they produce down the line, because you're not going to have people like that. If all the best people are going into finance, that means they're not going into foreign service. If they're not going into governance, they're not going into healthcare. There's a lot of possibilities out there where you think, well, I'd like a few of the best people to go into neurosurgery, please, right? So that's some of the sorts of issues and concerns we have. They're very aware of the economic situation. They feel it in their bones that this is going to be an issue coming up. In terms of general attitude, they're often they're more cynical than I think the students when I went to school were. It might be locational. It might be that I'm talking to Stevens students and not, say, Columbia students, or I did my undergraduate at Berkeley. Berkeley students are not cynical for the whole part, right? They're very idealistic for better and worse. But there's a way in which they see it as like, we talk about sometimes ethical issues in business or technology, and they are very, hey, man, you got to get paid. That's their approach. And my job as a humanist is to sort of prod that a little bit and sort of say, well, what are your limits? Everyone has limits in that respect. And, what do you think in the ideal versus the reality, versus the practical aspects? But they lean very high on things like, look, if your employer tells you to do it, you do it.
Yeah.
Oh, do you think it's a bad idea? Well, somebody else is going to do it even if you don't do it, so why not do it? And so we talk about these kinds of issues a lot. And I think on the whole, they lean towards philosophies that they intuitively lean towards philosophies that favor the employer, for better and worse. But that's kind of, I feel like, the repercussion of that economic insecurity. They just want to get the job. They want to keep their head down. They're not extremely politically active on the whole. They see getting a solid economic foundation as being absolutely the number one. And again, I'm not denigrating them. I actually think that if I grew up under the same circumstances, I'd feel the same way.
That's very practical. Last question for the segment, then we'll go to commercial break. We just did a story a week and a half ago about women in technology, and this University of Pittsburgh has something called She Innovates, where they bring in young women to work in teams and to collaborate. And I guess, there to get more people in technology. Are you finding the classes that you're teaching or the students that you're seeing in the halls a better mix of society?
It's tricky. So engineering schools in general don't have a great representation in terms of diversity. Stevens is pretty similar to most others. We have a 3-to-1 male to female ratio. And in terms of diversity, we have a lot of middle class New Jerseyans. So that tends to be white and, again, middle class. They've done a lot of work here to increase the diversity. We're starting to get more people from out of state. They would really like to be a place where you get out of state people. And they'd really like there to be more gender and racial diversity. In terms of the women we do get, I always tell people, we had a very elderly, he passed away recently, so I can speak about his views, sort of donor who came to campus once, and he had been an alumni here God knows how many years ago. And he said, my God, there's all these women around here. What do they do? And I said, they do everything. They major in everything you can imagine. And in my experience, they're often some of the best students. You don't, as I sometimes tell them, you don't end up here as a woman by the easy way, easy road, right? They are super self-selected. They are super dedicated. We don't live in a society that says, women, it's a great idea, you should become a civil engineer. We do have some institutions that try to promote that and things like that, but it's not the easiest way through. And so they're usually the ones who are working the hardest and are doing the full schedules and doing stuff that sounds just murderous to me. And they do a great job and they get good jobs and things like that. I think there's room to improve in terms of that. Some of this is a structural issue on a much larger basis than an individual university, right? So the way they talk about it sometimes is a pipeline problem. And you're only going to get you're only going to get the outcome, what's coming into the income. And so if your applications by women are a lot lower than men, then you're not going to get as many in the outcome. But there is a lot of effort. I was actually just talking with an undergraduate who's a senior a physics major just 2 days ago, and she had actually started a foundation, which these are, again, they're very entrepreneurial. They're taught to be entrepreneurial. She's a co-founder and co-CEO foundation that's all about giving mentorship to women in STEM from other women in STEM in different types of institutions, academia, government, labs, industry, things like that. And I like to think that kind of stuff will make a difference down the line.
That's incredible, and it sounds like things are advancing, and that's great to hear. Alex, I'm going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk more with Alex, and we'll get into one of his areas of expertise, nuclear history. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network. Welcome back. We're talking to Professor Alex Wellerstein from the Stevens Institute of Technology. Alex, thanks so much for sticking around this morning.
Happy to be here. This is fun.
Yeah, it's great to get your perspective. And now I want to, on the kids of today, I can say that as a middle-aged male. Been a while since I've been in college, but let's talk a little bit about some of the work that you're doing. And what I found very interesting is you are a historian of nuclear science and the history of use of nuclear weapons. How did you get into that? Before we talk about what that means, and how did you get into that area of expertise?
I've been studying nuclear weapons and nuclear power and nuclear technology and science in general for a long time now. I think I got interested in it because it's one of these areas where you have a bunch of essentially eggheads coming up with interesting ideas that initially nobody thinks has any application, right? They are doing early nuclear physics is synonymous with pointless, no outcomes, just why would it matter to know about the subatomic processes in an atom? Doesn't affect anything we do. And they are elevated from that to being some of the most important people in the world. And it turns out some of these experiments, so the first experiment to discover you could split the atom, uranium atoms, literally could be done on a good-sized dining room table, tabletop science. And within 6 years, people are saying we need to change the entire way in which the world operates, because the previous way in which we have these cycles of wars and big world wars and arms races and things like that, that will only lead to extinction. And there's just not a lot of instances in which something that you can discover on your table will cause people to rethink the nature of war or the nature of countries or the nature of budgets and things like that. So I've always found that interesting. And I will just say, as a historian, I like this. I study nuclear weapons, but I also study secrecy. And the reason I find it really fun is it's always like a detective game. There's stuff I'm not supposed to know. They black it out. They write delete it or something. But I want to tell a story. And I don't know. I want to tell a story of how the weapons developed or how they were thought about or how they were used. And so it's like a game of looking through all of these documents, and maybe some stuff's deleted and some stuff isn't, and figuring out, how do you weave the story? How do I find out what really mattered, even though I know there's stuff I'm not supposed to know or not supposed to have? And that makes it just sort of an endless, enjoyable hunt. And there's something it's like solving a puzzle or solving a mystery. I chose it as a topic both because it was interesting to me, but also something that I couldn't see ever getting bored with. And I will say, at the time that I chose it, people thought at times that it was not, didn't have a lot of relevance, that we have maybe in the world that was not going to be an issue going forward. This is sort of the early 2000s and thereabout. And boy, were they wrong.
Yeah,
and so it's also been a topic where I get the relevance of it seems sometimes disturbingly acute. But it's a place where the history actually informs the present and maybe informs ideas about the future in really tangible ways. And so that always makes it rewarding to do as well.
Of course, you have to be paying attention in order to take it, being aware of the history and studying the history, right? Our leaders need to be in that case. Let's talk about, you're also a coder, and you created something called Nuke Map, which is a site people can use to see the casualties. And that's actually used by casualties that are inflicted when a nuclear device is detonated. And that's something that's actually used by government. Is that correct?
I've had people in the government tell me that they use it. The most flattering thing I've ever been told about it, I got an email from someone in the military who works in one of the missile silos in the middle of the country, one of our ICBM silos. And he says they, of course, have their own software that the government makes to understand these things, but it feels weird to use it when you're just trying to experiment or play around. And so when they want to just quickly see what would happen in a given situation, they use my website instead, because it makes them feel a little less self-conscious about using this, probably $1 million government software about to simulate casualties or effects, where they can use mine very easily. Yeah, I made the Nuke Map a few years ago now. It's been about 8 years, actually. I'm a computer programmer. It's one of those things I've been doing on the side since high school. It's Never studied computer science, but kept up with the languages and sort of learned how to do things and got interested in web programming and data visualization. And I have a very hard time dealing with raw numbers. If you tell me the effect of this will go out to 2.2 miles, I have a pretty difficult understanding of that, and I think most people do. And so I find visualization is very useful. And so this is a topic I study. I know where the books are that tell me what the effects of a weapon are and how to calculate them. And so turning the equations in these old declassified government books into code that your web browser can run, it takes a little bit of work, but it's not impossible. You don't need Google to do this for you. It's if you know a little bit of programming, you can do this sort of thing. And so I made this website in 2012, and I put it up, and I didn't expect too many people to use it. I thought it'd be useful for teaching, and then it got very, very popular. It's been used by about 40 million people since I put it up, including about 60 hits from North Korea. So I don't know what that means, but there's somebody in North Korea who has played with this website.
It must be Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-sun, and Il Jong. It's probably the upper echelon, I would imagine.
It's a big contrast, the 60 hits from North Korea to about the 80,000 from South Korea. There's a difference in internet access there, right? So it's interesting. So it's a website where you can simulate nuclear weapons effects, and you can pick any place in the world, and you can pick any weapon, and there's a lot of options. And even just the fact that there are more than one weapon, and they really vary, and some are historical and some are modern, that's often surprising to people who don't think about nuclear weapons. They sort of think of there as being just the bomb, but there's really many options of types of bombs. And then you pick where you want it to go off, and you can pick whether you want it to tell you how many people will die, and you can even have it tell you where the radioactive contamination could go. And click a button and it'll show you all this very quickly. And so it's been sort of morbidly popular with people, but it also gets popular whenever there's this big nuclear issue in the media. So if North Korea tests another nuclear weapon, immediately people will go to the nuke map to say, okay, if they said that their weapon was 100 kilotons, what does that mean? How is that different from, say, the weapons from World War II? How is that different from the weapons of the 1950s? And you can sit there and get a sense of how these things change. And the goal for me is just to have people, there's not a strong political motivation or anything, but I feel like these are weapons that are in the world, and they're real, and we make policy decisions that affect not only what weapons are out there, but whether they might be used. And it's important for people to understand them in sort of concrete and tangible terms, and not as sort of abstract ideas, because they're just pieces of metal that we put together and keep in silos and things like that. And I do find when talking with people who have used it that this sort of thing helps you wrap your head around it. And amazingly, I take a lot of effort to not make it look like a political push. I've had people on the far left who use the website, as you would imagine, right? They talk about how horrible the weapons are. There have been people on the far right who have used the website for their own purposes. It got cited by Newt Gingrich not too long ago. And so there's sort of a spread between, I think of it as, on one hand, it's been used by Newt Gingrich. On the other hand, it's been used by Jon Stewart, right? And I feel like it's hard to do a website that could be used by that whole spectrum of politics in there. But nuclear weapons are a hot issue. And so I'm glad that I can at least bring a little bit of informed knowledge to it. And then what conclusion you draw from that knowledge, that's up to you. Yeah. But at least start in a place of agreement on what would happen. I think in a world where information is pretty polarized, it's important to find these places where we can agree and then decide where the politics are going to make us disagree.
Yeah. Last minute of the segment, you're also an author, and you have a book coming up. Anything you want to tell us about the book and what it's about and when we can expect it?
Sure. So the book is called Restricted Data. That's the title. Subtitle is something like, they're still finalizing this, History of Nuclear Secrecy in the United States. And the book is a history of how people have tried to control nuclear weapons by controlling information. And today we take it for granted. Of course, they're secret. Of course, they've got a big stamp on them. And they actually have their own special category of secrecy under U.S. law called restricted data. They're totally treated differently than other types of secrets. It's the only category like this. And the book is about how this sensibility evolved and who tried to push back at different times. And at times, how did they make this practical? It's very easy for me to say, yes, let's not let anybody know how the bomb works. Making that a reality is very difficult. Do I put everybody who knows about it in a reservation and not let them out? Do I make it so that if you, a private citizen, speculate on the bomb, you go to jail? There's all these complications in there. The importance of the story is not just because it's kind of interesting and you can learn a lot about the history of nuclear weapons by looking at secrecy, but we live in the world that the sort of Cold War decisions made real. So this is deeply tied to the rise of the national security state. It's deeply tied to the rise of secrecy generally in the United States, which is much larger than most people know. We have massive institutions spending massive amounts of money in ways that are often very unaccountable. And whether or not you think this is something that should all be burned down, I conclude that that's not likely to happen. You're not going to sort of turn back time and somehow undo all of this stuff, or you're thinking about what should we be thinking about going forward. I think that the history helps inform you because it shows you that the way things aren't necessarily set in stone. They're made. We live with the result of choices made by people in the past who are doing their best most of the time. But they're making choices in the context of, say, 1954, not 2020, and things like that. Anyway, the book should be out ideally later this year. University of Chicago Press. Keep an eye out for it. If people are interested, they can see my website, nuclearsecrecy.com, for all things nuclear secrecy. And I have a blog, and the Nuke Map is on there. But that's where I sort of collate all of my public output. And the book will certainly be featured on there when it's ready.
Well, can't wait for it. Congratulations. And it was a pleasure speaking with you, learning more about technology, learning about STEM, the students, and hearing about your endeavors in nuclear history. Alex Wellerstein, professor with Stevens Institute of Technology. Thanks so much for joining us on the program today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. This was really fun.
And folks, that wraps up our episodes of BRN AM this week, but we're not done because tomorrow we're back with our weekly show, BRN Weekly, where we take a look back at the hottest segments of the week. And we're also going to be joined in segment one by Devin Banerjee, Senior Financial Services Editor for LinkedIn. You're not going to want to miss the show. And don't forget, for all the news in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Keep on saving and roll with the changes.